146 BCE, Rome definitively destroys Carthage. After more than a century of rivalry, its great enemy disappears in flames at the end of the Third Punic War. That same year, Rome also imposes its domination over Greece with the destruction of Corinth. In just a few months, two worlds collapse, and Rome, which had once been only an ambitious Italian city, becomes one of the greatest powers in the entire Mediterranean. But this victory also marks the beginning of a deep imbalance, because the more Rome grows, the harder its republic becomes to control. No. The wars bring wealth, land, and above all, a very large number of slaves. These slaves are captured during the conquest, then sold again or used in households or in the harshest workplaces. For the Great Roman families, this is a considerable source of wealth. But as Rome grows richer, part of its population becomes poorer. In the Italian countryside, the small landowners who had long formed the foundation of the Republic are the first to be affected. These men often own a few pieces of land, just enough to support their families. But they are also the ones Rome calls on when it is time to go to war. Now, in the 2nd century BCE, military campaigns are no longer limited to the areas around Italy. Soldiers are sent farther and farther away, sometimes for a long periods. During their absence, the fields are cultivated less, income decreases, and debt can quickly pile up. When they return, some find a weakened farm, sometimes impossible to save. Little by little, the small farms disappear in favor of great agricultural estates, the latifundia. These latifundia become one of the symbols of this new Rome. They are vast properties belonging to the elites, often worked by slaves. For the rich, the system is profitable. For poor citizens, it is destructive. They lose their land and therefore their independence, and sometimes even their place in Roman society. Later, this reality will deeply affect certain reformers. According to Plutarch, Tiberius Gracchus was struck during a journey through Etruria by these countrysides where free men seemed to have been replaced by servile labor brought in from abroad. 133 BCE, while social tensions have been building for several years. Tiberius Gracchus tries to attack inequality directly. That year, he becomes tribune of the plebs, a political office originally created to protect the more modest citizens from the abuses of the powerful. His project touches one of the most sensitive subjects in Rome: land ownership. Tiberius wants to limit the seizure of public lands by the great aristocratic families. He therefore proposes to recover part of them and redistribute them to poor citizens. His idea is not only social, it is also political and military in purpose. By giving land back to poor citizens, he hopes to restore their independence, their place in society, and perhaps also preserve the old model of the citizen soldier. But for the Senate and the great families, this reform is a direct threat. It challenges their interests and their influence. Very quickly, the debate is no longer only about land. It becomes a struggle over who truly has the right to decide the future of the Republic. The tension rises even more when Tiberius forces the issue to push his reform forward. Since the Senate blocks his project, he turns directly to the people, bypassing the usual political customs. For his opponents, this is a troubling scene. Tiberius would no longer be only a reformer, he would be trying to concentrate power in his own hands. In Rome, this accusation is explosive. Since the fall of the kings, the word tyranny has been frightening. And this is precisely this word that his enemies begin to use against him. In 133 BCE, the crisis degenerates. Tiberius Gracchus is killed along with several of his supporters during a confrontation led by his political opponents. It is the first time that political violence strikes the heart of the Republic so brutally. Rome then understands that a political conflict is no longer settled only through speeches, votes, or alliances. From now on, it can also be settled by force. 10 years later, in 123 BCE, his brother Gaius Gracchus takes up the fight again. He too becomes tribune of the plebs, and then he is re-elected in 122 BCE. But Gaius does not simply take up Tiberius' project exactly as it was. He seeks to transform the political balance of Rome more broadly. He continues the agrarian reform, but he also puts in place measures meant to help the people, especially around the price of grain. He supports colony projects to settle citizens on new lands, and he wants to give more rights to Rome's Italian allies, those peoples who often fight alongside the Romans without receiving the same privileges as them. For his opponents, Gaius in turn becomes a danger. In 121 BCE, the crisis breaks out. Gaius Gracchus also dies amid political repression. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, the two brothers also called the Gracchi, did not destroy Rome, but their struggle reveals a republic already deeply weakened. After the Gracchi, the Roman Republic continues to function, but it remains open. The long question is not resolved difficulty persist. After the Gracchi, the Roman Republic continues to function, but its tensions remain open. The land question is not resolved. Inequalities persist, and many poor citizens no longer truly have a place in the old Roman balance. It is in this context that Gaius Marius appears. In 107 BCE, Marius is elected consul. He is an important figure because he does not belong to the old senatorial aristocracy. In Rome, this is called a new man, a man who reaches the highest office without coming from a family already established at the top of the state for generations. This origin matters a great deal. Marius embodies a form of social rise in a republic still dominated by the great families. He is not only an effective military leader, he also becomes the symbol of a Roman world in full transformation. During this period, Rome needs soldiers, but some of those who once formed the foundation of the army no longer have the means to fulfill that role. Marius then opens the army more widely to poor citizens. Men without land, without fortune, and without a clear future can now join the legions. For them, the army becomes a possibility of survival, but also of advancement. It offers pay, structure, a leader, and the hope of one day receiving a reward. This development profoundly transforms the relationship between soldiers and their generals. Before, the Roman soldier is first of all a citizen who temporarily serves the Republic. With Marius, we begin to see the appearance of a more permanent, more professional army, made up of men who depend more heavily on their military career. The general then becomes a central figure. He is the one who commands, who leads to victory, who distributes the spoils, and who can promise land to his veterans. Normally, magistracies are limited in time, precisely to prevent one citizen from becoming too dominant. But the context is tense, and Rome is going through a serious military crisis. Peoples from the north, the Cimbri and the Teutons, threaten the Roman world. The fear is immense. Rome still remembers the old trauma of the Gallic invasion several centuries earlier. Marius then appears as the man capable of saving the Republic. In 102 BCE, he defeats the Teutons. The following year, he crushes the Cimbri. These victories make him a military hero. In the eyes of many Romans, he is no longer only a consul. He is the one who protected Rome from an existential danger. But this glory creates a dangerous precedent. Rome gains in military efficiency, but without knowing it, it creates a new internal threat. Generals capable of relying on their soldiers to impose their political will. Around 90 BCE, Rome is plunged into one of the most serious crises of its republican history, the Social War. Despite its name, it does not refer to a war between social classes. The term comes from the Latin "socii", the allies. These Italian allies have fought for generations alongside Rome, provided soldiers, taken part in its conquests, but remained excluded from full Roman citizenship. By demanding the same rights as the citizens of Rome, they provoke a brutal conflict that reveals a deep fracture at the heart of Roman Italy. The war is violent. It takes place in the very heart of Italy. Allied cities rise up, organize their own confederations, and some even go so far as to mint their own coinage to assert their independence. Rome then understands that it cannot simply crush this revolt without transforming its own system. To divide its opponents and calm part of Italy, it gradually grants citizenship to those who remain loyal, then to a large part of the Italians. In 90 BCE, the Lex Julia opens citizenship to the allies who have not taken up arms against Rome, or who agree to lay them down. Then, in 89 BCE, other laws expand these rights even further. Little by little, Roman citizenship moved beyond the walls of Rome and spreads to a large part of the Italian peninsula, from Latium to the regions of central and southern Italy. It is an immense political victory for the Italian allies, but it is also a decisive turning point for Rome. The Republic becomes larger, more inclusive, almost Italian as a whole. for the first time the instrument of a general against his political opponents in the very heart of the Republic. He imposes his decisions. He then leaves again for the east to fight Mithridates, the powerful king of Pontus, a kingdom located north of Anatolia. This formidable opponent is then one of Rome's greatest enemies in the east. But while Sulla moves away from the capital, Rome does not regain calm. This formidable opponent is then one of Rome's greatest enemy in the east. But while Sulla moves away from the capital, Rome does not regain calm. His opponents take advantage of his absence to regain the upper hand. The consul Cinna joins forces with Marius, returned from exile, and together they retake the city in 87 BCE. Rome then plunges into a new wave of political violence. Sulla's supporters are hunted down, some are executed, and the Republic enters into a logic of revenge. Marius becomes consul again in 86 BCE, but he dies a few days later. Between 83 and 82 BCE, Sulla returns to Italy with his army. This time, he returns to retake Rome. Civil war breaks out again, until the Battle of the Colline Gate in 82 BCE, very close to the capital. Sulla wins and becomes the master of the Republic. That same year, he has himself appointed dictator. In Roman tradition, this office exists to respond to an exceptional crisis. But Sulla uses it to reorganize the state in depth. In 79 BCE, Sulla voluntarily gives up power and he dies the following year. But after him, the illusion of an intact order is shattered, because Rome has discovered that a victorious general could impose his will by force of arms. In 73 BCE, the Roman Republic is marked by the violence of Sulla's time. But this time, the danger does not come from an ambitious general or warfare value. In the Senate, in 73 BCE, the Roman Republic is still marked by the violence of Sulla's time. But this time, the danger does not come from an ambitious general or a rivalry in the Senate. It comes from a much more unexpected place. A gladiator school in Capua, in southern Italy. It is there that a gladiator of Thracian origin, named Spartacus, escapes with several companions. Very quickly, the escape turns into a mass uprising. manages to defeat several forces sent against him. Rome, which dominates the Mediterranean, finds itself humiliated by an army of slaves formed on its own soil. In 72 BCE, the revolt becomes a serious danger. Spartacus is no longer only a fleeing gladiator. He becomes the symbol of a deep fear among the Roman elites. Because if the slaves rise up in large numbers, an entire economic and social system may collapse. In 71 BCE, the command against Spartacus is given to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome. Crassus understands that this war is also a political opportunity. If he crushes the revolt, he does not only save Roman order, he gains immense prestige. He finally catches up with Spartacus' troops in southern Italy. The slave army, exhausted and trapped, then attempts one last battle. According to ancient sources, Spartacus fought to the end among his men. His body is never found with certainty. For Rome, this military victory is not enough. Spartacus' defeat must be turned into a warning. Crassus then has about 6,000 survivors crucified along the Appian Way, the great road that connects Capua to Rome. The message is brutal. Those who defy Rome must be seen, punished, and made into an example. But at the very moment when Crassus crushes the revolt, Pompey returns from Spain with his troops. He captures some of the last fugitives and also claims part of the victory. Spartacus is dead. The revolt is crushed. But already, in Rome, another struggle begins. The struggle for prestige between the great generals. In 70 BCE, Crassus and Pompey are elected consuls. They have almost nothing in common. One has imposed himself through his immense wealth. The other through his military victories and his popularity among the soldiers. They do not really like each other. And yet, Rome can no longer pretend they do not exist. At this time, power in Rome no longer rests only on laws or traditions. It begins to gather around men capable of bearing support, commanding armies, and imposing their will on the Republic itself. In 67 BCE, this development becomes even more visible. The Mediterranean is then threatened by pirates. This is not only a maritime problem. The pirates disrupt trade, threaten the grain supply, and give the Romans the feeling that their world is no longer safe. To settle the crisis, Rome gives Pompey an extraordinary command. He receives immense powers over the Mediterranean and over a large part of the coast. In a few months, he manages to reduce the threat. The success is spectacular, but the precedent is just as spectacular. Once again, faced with fear, Rome accepts concentrating enormous power in the hands of a single man. From 66 BCE onward, Pompey receives a new major command, this time in the east, against Mithridates VI of Pontus, Rome's old enemy already fought by Sulla. But this campaign goes far beyond a simple military victory. Pompey pushes back Mithridates, strengthens Roman influence in Asia Minor, then advances as far as Syria and Judea. In a few years, he does not merely win battles, he reorganizes a large part of the Roman East and imposes Rome as the dominant power in the region. When he returns, he is no longer only a prestigious general. He is the man who secured the Mediterranean, defeated Rome's enemies in the east, and redrew part of the Roman world. His prestige becomes immense. Meanwhile, another man moves forward, more quietly, but with remarkable ambition, Julius Caesar. Caesar is born in 100 BCE into a patrician family, the Juliae, which claims descent from the goddess Venus through the hero Aeneas. His name belongs to a very prestigious line, but his family is no longer among the most powerful in Rome. Caesar grows up in a world marked by civil wars, the rivalries between Marius and Sulla, and political violence. This past matters a great deal. Through his family and his alliances, Caesar is connected to the camp of Marius, Sulla's opponent. Very young, he therefore understands that Roman politics is not only a matter of speeches and elections, it is also a world of loyalties, debts, dangers, and memory. In the 70s and 60s BCE, Caesar does not yet have Pompey's army, nor Crassus' fortune, but he very quickly understands one essential thing. In a republic in crisis, popularity can become a weapon. To understand how Caesar becomes so popular, I invite you to let yourself be carried away by the next episode, now appearing on your screen. There we will see how this ambitious man will leave the corridors of Rome to enter history through dangerous alliances and through the Gallic Wars, which will make him